Story number 1.
The autumn wind howled through the dense trees as Maya adjusted the rearview mirror of her old sedan. She had planned this road trip to escape the pressures of city life, mapping out a scenic route through the rural backroads of Pennsylvania. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and twilight was fast fading into an inky blackness. The twisting roads were lined with towering oaks and pines, their skeletal branches forming a canopy overhead. Her GPS chirped, recalculating for the third time in 10 minutes. Maya glanced at the screen and frowned. The map had frozen, leaving her without a clear route back to the main highway. She hadn't seen another car in miles, and the road signs were sparse. She rounded a curve and saw a weathered wooden sign partially hidden by vines. Hartswell Hollow, 4 miles. Maya sighed in relief. Surely, the small town would have gas, a diner, or at least a friendly face to point her in the right direction. She took the turn toward Hartswell Hollow. The road narrowed, the trees pressing closer, their gnarled branches occasionally scraping against her car. Her high beams cut through the darkness, revealing potholes and a strange mist that seemed to rise from the asphalt. The deeper she drove, the quieter it became. Even the rhythmic chirping of crickets had faded, leaving an unsettling silence. As she approached the town, her headlights illuminated rows of dilapidated houses with sagging roofs and shattered windows. The mist thickened, clinging to the ground like a ghostly veil. Maya slowed the car, her stomach knotting. Something about the place felt wrong, abandoned, yet watchful. She finally spotted a gas station at the edge of the town square. Its flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow over rusted pumps and a peeling sign that read, Hartswell Fuel. Maya pulled in and stepped out of the car, shivering as the cold seeped through her jacket. Inside the station, an old man stood behind the counter. He wore a tattered plaid shirt, and his face was weathered, like cracked leather. He looked up as Maya entered, his expression unreadable. "Evening," she said, forcing a smile. "I think I took a wrong turn. Can you tell me how to get back to the highway?" The man stared at her for a moment before speaking, his voice low and gravelly. "Highway's a ways from here. Best to head back the way you came." Maya hesitated. "Isn't there a faster route? My GPS isn't working." He glanced out the window, his eyes narrowing. "Don't rely on machines out here. They don't work right." He paused, then added, "And don't stay long." His words sent a chill down her spine. She thanked him and hurried back to her car. As she climbed in, she noticed the mist had grown thicker, swirling in strange patterns. The lights in the gas station flickered and then went out completely. Maya started the engine and drove back toward the edge of town. But no matter how far she went, the road seemed to loop back to the square. She passed the same boarded-up buildings, the same eerie gas station, over and over again. Panic set in as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. She stopped the car and looked around, her heart racing. That's when she saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just at the edge of her headlights. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered black dress, her long hair obscuring her face. Maya honked the horn, but the figure didn't move. Taking a deep breath, she rolled down the window slightly. "Do you need help?" she called out. The woman lifted her head, revealing hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Then, without a sound, she turned and began walking into the woods. Against her better judgment, Maya put the car in park and stepped out. "Wait," she called, her voice trembling. "Do you know how to get out of here?" The woman disappeared into the trees, but Maya could hear the faint crunch of leaves and twigs. She hesitated, then grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to follow the sound. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the mist curling around her ankles. She followed the faint sound of footsteps, her flashlight barely piercing the gloom. After a few minutes, she came to a clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone well. The air was icy, and Maya's breath formed clouds as she approached. The woman was there, standing on the other side of the well. "Please," Maya said, her voice shaking. "I just want to leave." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised an arm and pointed into the well. Maya's flashlight flickered as she stepped closer. The smell of damp earth and decay filled her nostrils. Peering into the well, she saw nothing but darkness. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice echoing. A sudden sound made her spin around, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees. Dozens of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, and she realized she was surrounded. Shadowy figures emerged, their forms twisted and wrong, their faces frozen in grotesque expressions of anguish. Maya stumbled back, her foot slipping on the mossy edge of the well. She screamed as she fell, her flashlight tumbling into the abyss. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the woman's face, peering down at her with that same twisted smile. When Maya's car was found weeks later, it was covered in a fine layer of dust, as though it had been sitting abandoned for years. The gas station attendant swore he had seen her that night, but no one in the town of Hartswell Hollow could explain what had happened to her. The clearing with the well was eventually discovered by hikers, but the stories they told of hearing whispers and seeing shadowy figures ensured that few dared venture near it. Maya was never seen again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a clear September evening when Sarah and her brother Matt set out on their road trip. They were headed to a small mountain cabin their parents had rented for the weekend, and the plan was simple: follow the main highway and arrive before sunset. But as they approached the final stretch, a detour sign loomed ahead, forcing them off the familiar route. "Relax," Matt said, seeing the worry on Sarah's face. "It's just a detour. GPS will get us there." The road they turned onto was narrow, winding, and deserted. Their GPS recalculated, suggesting another turn, one that would supposedly save time. Trusting the device, they took it, not realizing they had made the wrong turn. The pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. Trees towered on either side, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the fading sunlight. The deeper they drove, the more oppressive the forest became, the air thick with an unnatural silence. "Are you sure this is right?" Sarah asked, glancing at the screen. Matt frowned. The GPS showed a thin, winding line ahead, but no landmarks or nearby roads. "It says it's a shortcut," he replied, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The car bumped over a pothole, jolting them both. "We should turn around," Sarah insisted. Matt slowed down, but the road was so narrow that reversing or finding a place to turn was nearly impossible. As they pressed on, they came across a wooden sign, its paint faded and letters barely legible. "Hollow Creek," Matt read aloud. "Never heard of it." "Neither have I," Sarah said. "This feels wrong, Matt. We should go back." Before he could respond, the car's headlights caught movement up ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated in the stark glow. It was a woman, her back to them, wearing a tattered white dress. Matt slammed the brakes and the car skidded to a stop. "Is she okay?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," Matt said. He rolled down his window and called out, "Ma'am, do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She stood eerily still, her head tilted slightly to one side. "Maybe we should just go around her," Sarah suggested, her grip on the door handle tightening. As Matt prepared to drive around, the woman moved. Slowly, unnaturally, she turned her head to look at them. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide and hollow, like dark pits. Her lips stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing yellowed teeth. "Go!" Sarah screamed. Matt floored the gas, swerving to avoid her. The woman didn't chase them, but her twisted smile stayed burned into their minds. As they sped away, Sarah kept looking back, but the road behind them was empty. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Matt said, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The road ahead became rougher, and the forest seemed to close in even tighter. The GPS lost signal, leaving them with no sense of direction. Soon, the car's headlights illuminated an old wooden bridge spanning a narrow creek. "We have to cross," Matt said, though he didn't sound confident. The bridge creaked under the car's weight, the wooden planks groaning as they drove over it. Sarah held her breath, clutching the edge of her seat. When they reached the other side, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," Matt muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine cranked but wouldn't start. "Why now?" Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the dense woods around them. They sat in silence for a moment, the darkness pressing in. Then faint footsteps echoed on the bridge behind them. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Matt nodded, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. A shadow moved at the edge of the headlights, growing larger as the footsteps grew louder. "Lock the doors," Matt said, his voice low and urgent. Sarah fumbled with the lock as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same woman. Her head tilted, that same awful grin plastered across her face. "She's following us," Sarah whispered, her breath hitching. The woman stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her bare feet scraped against the gravel, her hollow eyes locked on the car. Matt turned the key again, desperation in his movements. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. "Hold on," he shouted, slamming the car into gear and speeding forward. The woman didn't chase them. She simply stood in the road, her figure shrinking in the rearview mirror until it vanished. They drove in silence, their hearts pounding, the forest never seeming to end. The road twisted and turned, but there were no signs, no other cars, no signs of life. Then, up ahead, they saw it, a small house, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. "Maybe they have a phone," Sarah said, though she didn't sound hopeful. Matt hesitated but pulled into the driveway. The house looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and its roof sagging. The front porch creaked under their footsteps as they approached the door. Matt knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was cold and smelled of mildew. "Hello?" Matt called out. No response. "Maybe we shouldn't go in," Sarah said, pulling at his arm. "We need help," Matt insisted, stepping inside. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound their footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Dust covered every surface, and faded family portraits hung crookedly on the walls. They entered what appeared to be the living room. A single chair sat in the center, facing a cold, empty fireplace. On the mantel above it was a photograph in a cracked frame. Matt picked it up. It was an old black and white photo of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The woman in the picture wore a tattered white dress. "It's her," Sarah whispered, pointing at the woman. Before Matt could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house. "What was that?" Sarah hissed, her eyes wide. Matt didn't answer. He grabbed her hand and started toward the door. As they reached the porch, the air grew icy and the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. "Run," Matt said, pulling Sarah toward the car. They didn't look back as they climbed in, slamming the doors shut. Matt started the engine, and the car roared to life. As they sped away, Sarah glanced out the window. The woman stood in the doorway of the house, her dark eyes watching them. The road ahead twisted and turned, but they eventually found themselves back on the highway, the forest behind them. Neither of them spoke the rest of the drive. When they reached the cabin, they locked every door and window, too shaken to sleep. The next morning, Matt checked the car. His blood ran cold when he saw the scratches running along the sides, as if something or someone had clawed at it during the night. They never spoke of the wrong turn again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield as Sarah squinted through the blurry darkness. She had left her best friend's wedding reception hours ago, trying to make it home before midnight, but a wrong turn on the back roads had landed her in unfamiliar territory. Her GPS had lost its signal 30 minutes ago, leaving her with only the faint beam of her headlights to guide her through the winding forest road. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches arching overhead like bony arms reaching for each other. There were no streetlights, no signs, no other cars, just the endless stretch of cracked asphalt disappearing into the abyss ahead. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her heart racing with unease. Every instinct told her she shouldn't be here, but she had no choice but to press on. As the road curved sharply, she noticed a small wooden sign on the side of the road. It was faded and nearly illegible, but she managed to make out the words, "Briar Hollow, 2 miles." She frowned. That name wasn't on her map earlier. Maybe it was a small town where she could stop and ask for directions. Encouraged by the possibility of finding help, she followed the road as it descended into a dense, misty valley. The rain began to ease, but the air grew heavier and an unnatural silence blanketed the forest. The only sound was the faint hum of her car engine and the occasional creak of tree branches. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the town. If it could even be called that. The place was eerily still, with narrow cobblestone streets lined by old, crumbling buildings. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the ones that weren't revealed dark, empty interiors. A single street lamp flickered weakly at the center of the square, casting long, distorted shadows. There was no sign of life, no people, no cars, not even the sound of animals. Sarah pulled into what looked like an abandoned parking lot near a small diner with a neon sign that read, "Open," though half the letters had burned out. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn around and leave, but desperation won out. She grabbed her coat and stepped out of the car. The air was icy, much colder than it should have been for late spring. She walked toward the diner, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound making her jump. Inside, the diner looked like it had been frozen in time. The red vinyl booths were cracked and faded, and the linoleum floor was scuffed and dirty. A jukebox sat in the corner, its lights flickering sporadically. Behind the counter stood a man in a grease-stained apron. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too dark, too deep. "Evenin'," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You lost?" Sarah hesitated. Something about his tone made her uneasy, but she forced a polite smile. "Yeah, I think I took a wrong turn. I'm trying to get back to the highway. Can you help?" The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his eyes unblinking. Finally, he nodded toward a chair. "Sit. Roads around here can be tricky at night. Best to wait out the dark." "No, thank you," Sarah said quickly. "I just need directions." The man's expression didn't change, but he shrugged. "Suit yourself. Head out of town the way you came. Take the first right. But mind the fog. It don't like strangers." She frowned. "The fog?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked into the back room, leaving her alone in the diner. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive. Without another word, Sarah backed out of the diner and returned to her car. The street lamp outside flickered and went out completely as she climbed into the driver's seat. She locked the doors, her hands trembling as she started the engine. The directions the man had given seemed simple enough, but the way he'd said it, "The fog doesn't like strangers," sent a shiver down her spine. As she drove out of town, the mist began to thicken, swirling around the car like smoke. The road was narrow and winding, the trees pressing in closer with every mile. Her headlights barely cut through the dense fog, and she struggled to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Sarah slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The figure was a woman, dressed in a long, tattered dress that fluttered unnaturally in the still air. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, and her long, matted hair obscured her face. Sarah rolled down her window a crack, her voice shaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised her arm and pointed to the side of the road, toward a narrow path that disappeared into the woods. Before Sarah could say anything else, the woman vanished, dissolving into the mist like smoke on the wind. Panic surged through Sarah. She floored the gas pedal, desperate to put distance between herself and whatever she had just seen. But the road twisted and turned, and no matter how far she drove, it felt like she was going in circles. Every few minutes she passed the same landmarks: a broken-down mailbox, a rusted-out truck, a tree split by lightning. And then she saw the woman again, standing in the same spot, pointing toward the woods. This time, her patience snapped. She rolled down her window fully and screamed, "What do you want from me?" The woman tilted her head, her face still hidden that fright, and whispered a single word that carried on the wind like a hiss. "Leave." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She reversed the car and sped back toward the town, her heart pounding. But when she reached the outskirts, the diner was gone. The entire town was gone. In its place was an overgrown field, the remnants of foundations barely visible beneath the weeds. She stopped the car, her breath coming in short gasps. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, but it still had no signal. She looked around, desperate for any sign of civilization, but the mist was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like a living thing. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, dozens of them. Their faces were pale and featureless, their eyes empty sockets that seemed to bore into her soul. They surrounded the car, their movements slow and deliberate, their mouths opening in silent screams. Sarah screamed too, slamming her foot on the gas. The car surged forward, plowing through the mist. The figures faded into the darkness, but the road seemed endless, stretching on forever without end. When she finally emerged from the forest, it was dawn. The mist had vanished, and the familiar hum of the highway was a welcome sound. She pulled over at the first gas station she saw, trembling as she stepped out of the car. The attendant eyed her with concern. "You all right, miss? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah didn't answer. She just glanced at the GPS, which was working again, and saw that Briar Hollow wasn't listed anywhere on the map. As she drove away, she checked the rearview mirror one last time and froze. Sitting in the back seat was the woman in the tattered dress, her hollow eyes staring straight ahead. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
It was nearing midnight when Ethan and his friends, Rachel, Mike, and Jenna, realized they were hopelessly lost. What was supposed to be a simple weekend road trip had turned into a nightmare when their GPS stopped working in the middle of a remote countryside. They had planned to visit an old vineyard for a tasting event, but after missing a turn on the highway, they ended up driving down an endless stretch of desolate backroads. Rachel leaned forward from the back seat, squinting at the dark, unfamiliar surroundings. "I told you we should have turned around an hour ago," she said, her voice edged with frustration. Mike, who was driving, gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I swear the GPS said this way was faster." "Well, it's not," Jenna muttered from the passenger seat, staring nervously out the window. "This place is giving me the creeps." Ethan, sitting beside Rachel, tried to lighten the mood. "It's just a country road. Relax. We'll find a gas station or something soon." But as the minutes ticked by, the sense of unease grew. The road narrowed, flanked by dense woods that seemed to press closer with every mile. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Look," Jenna pointed ahead, her voice breaking the silence. "There's a sign." Mike slowed the car as they approached a weathered wooden sign partially obscured by overgrown weeds. The paint was faded, but they could make out the words, "Black Hollow Road." "Does that sound like a shortcut to anyone else?" Rachel asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "We don't have many options," Mike replied, turning the wheel onto the narrow dirt road. "It has to lead somewhere." The car jolted over uneven ground as they ventured deeper into the woods. The trees above formed an almost complete canopy, blocking out the moonlight. "This doesn't feel right," Jenna said, clutching her jacket tightly. "We should turn back," Mike sighed. "And go where? We're already in the middle of nowhere." Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road. A woman in a long, tattered dress was staring at them, her face obscured by her matted hair. "Holy, do you see that?" Ethan exclaimed. "Yeah," Mike said, slowing the car. "Should we stop?" "No," Rachel said quickly, her eyes wide. "Just keep driving." "She might need help," Jenna argued, but her voice wavered. Mike pulled the car to a stop, the engine idling. He rolled down his window slightly and called out, "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. She stood completely still, her head slightly tilted, as if listening. "Let's just go," Rachel urged, panic creeping into her voice. Before Mike could make a decision, the woman's head snapped toward the car. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were completely black. A chilling smile spread across her face, revealing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. "Drive!" Rachel screamed. Mike slammed on the gas, and the car sped past the woman. Everyone turned to look out the back window, but she was gone, as if she had vanished into thin air. "Did you see her face?" Jenna whispered, her hands trembling. "Don't talk about it," Rachel said, her voice shaking. The road twisted and turned, seeming to go on forever. The trees grew denser, their branches scraping against the sides of the car. The air inside grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, his voice tight with fear. But the road only seemed to lead them deeper into the woods. Then the car's engine began to sputter. "No, no, no," Mike muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The engine stalled and the car rolled to a stop. "What's happening?" Rachel asked, her voice rising. "I don't know." Mike tried turning the key, but the engine wouldn't start. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "Do you hear that?" Jenna asked suddenly, her eyes wide. Everyone fell silent, straining to listen. Faint footsteps echoed from the woods, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. "She's coming," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. A loud thud hit the roof of the car, and everyone screamed. "Get out of here!" Ethan yelled. "I'm trying," Mike shouted, frantically turning the key. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas. The car lurched forward, but the thudding continued. It sounded like someone or something was crawling across the roof. "Don't stop," Jenna pleaded. Suddenly, the roof caved slightly, and a pale, clawed hand smashed against the windshield. The woman's face appeared, grinning that same grotesque smile as her black eyes stared into the car. Mike swerved, sending the car skidding off the road. The woman was thrown off, disappearing into the darkness as they crashed into a shallow ditch. Everyone sat in stunned silence, the only sound their ragged breathing. "Is everyone okay?" Ethan finally asked. "Yeah," Rachel said, though her voice was shaky. Mike tried the engine again, and to their relief, it sputtered to life. He backed the car out of the ditch and onto the road. "Let's just get out of here," he said, his voice firm. They drove in silence, spent their eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. Finally, the trees began to thin, and they saw the glow of streetlights in the distance. As they merged onto a paved road, everyone let out a collective sigh of relief. "We're never talking about this again," Rachel said, breaking the silence. "Agreed," Ethan said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The next morning, when they stopped at a gas station, Mike noticed something that made his blood run cold. Deep scratches ran along the roof and sides of the car as if something had clawed at it during the night. He didn't tell the others. Some things he decided were better left unspoken.
Story number 5.
The night was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds that loomed over the deserted stretch of highway. Eric had been driving for hours, desperate to make it home after a weekend camping trip. His phone's battery had died hours ago, leaving him reliant on the fading paper map crumpled on the passenger seat. As he neared an unfamiliar fork in the road, Eric slowed the car, squinting at the faded sign. The left path led to the highway, but the sign indicated it was closed for construction. The right path, marked Black Hollow Road, wasn't on his map. He hesitated, debating whether to double back or take a chance. The thought of wasting hours turning around made his decision. He took the right turn. The road narrowed quickly, the pavement giving way to uneven gravel. Towering trees lined both sides, their gnarled branches creating a canopy that swallowed his car in darkness. His headlights seemed weaker now, the beams barely piercing the heavy mist that crept in from the forest floor. Minutes turned into an hour, and the road seemed endless, twisting and winding without any sign of another car or a turnoff. Unease crept over Eric as the silence pressed against his ears. No animals rustled in the underbrush, no insects chirped. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As he rounded a sharp curve, his headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Eric slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the loose gravel. The car lurched to a stop just feet from the figure. A young woman dressed in a white gown, her hair hanging in damp, matted strands over her face. Eric's heart raced. He rolled down the window slightly, his voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't move. She just stood there, her head tilted to one side, her arms hanging limp at her sides. Eric waited, the silence unbearable. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed to the left side of the road, toward a narrow trail disappearing into the trees. "Look, I don't know what you want, but I can call someone when I get to town," Eric said, his voice shaking. Still, she didn't move. Her hand remained outstretched, pointing. Her presence was suffocating, unnatural, as though she didn't belong to the world of the living. Eric's instincts screamed at him to drive away, but curiosity, or perhaps a sense of guilt, kept him rooted. He turned the wheel slightly, angling his car toward the trail. The woman lowered her hand and stepped aside, vanishing into the shadows of the trees. Eric pressed on, the gravel crunching beneath his tires as he followed the narrow path. The deeper he drove, the denser the forest became, the mist curling around the car like ghostly fingers. The air grew colder, and he noticed the faint smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted iron. Suddenly, the road opened into a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling house, its windows shattered and its roof partially caved in. Vines crawled up the walls and the front door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Eric stopped the car and stared. Something about the house felt off, as though it was watching him. He considered turning around, but the narrow path had no room to reverse, and backing out in the dark seemed impossible. Against his better judgment, he stepped out of the car. The moment his feet hit the ground, the air grew heavier, thicker. It was as if the forest was holding him in place, trapping him. He approached the house cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the overgrown gravel. The porch groaned under his weight as he stepped onto it. He pushed the door open, the rusted hinges screeching in protest. Inside, the house was eerily still. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and the remains of what looked like old photographs. Eric picked up one of the photos. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. They were standing in front of the very house he was in, but their faces were blurred, as though time had erased their features. A sudden noise made him freeze. It was faint, like a whisper, coming from upstairs. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. There was no response, just the faint creak of footsteps above him. Against every instinct, he climbed the staircase, his heart pounding. The steps groaned under his weight, and the air grew colder with each step. At the top of the stairs was a long hallway with several doors, most of them hanging off their hinges. The whispering grew louder, coming from the room at the end of the hall. Eric hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Inside was a child's bedroom, untouched by time. A small bed with a tattered quilt sat in the corner, and toys were scattered across the floor. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then he saw her. The woman from the road stood in the corner of the room, her back to him. She was facing a cracked mirror, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Eric's breath caught in his throat. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice a guttural rasp. The room began to shake, the walls vibrating violently as the air filled with a deafening roar. Eric stumbled back, tripping over a broken toy as the floor seemed to collapse beneath him. He woke up in his car, the engine idling. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the forest. The mist was gone, and the path that had led him to the house was now overgrown with weeds, as though it hadn't been used in decades. Shaking, Eric drove back to the main road, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the place. When he finally reached the nearest town, he stopped at a diner and asked a local about the road he had taken. The old man behind the counter paled at the mention of Black Hollow Road. "That place has been abandoned for years," he said. "There's nothing down that way but the old Whitmore house. Family died there. Fire took the parents, and the little girl disappeared. Some say her spirit still lingers, luring people who take the wrong turn." Eric didn't respond. He simply paid for his coffee and left, vowing never to drive those back roads again. He never spoke about what he saw that night, but every now and then, when driving late at night, he swore he could see her reflection in his rearview mirror.
Story number 6.
It was nearing midnight when Jake realized he had taken a wrong turn. The drive back from his college buddy's house was supposed to be simple, a straight shot on the highway for 2 hours. But an accident had forced him onto unfamiliar back roads. His phone was dead, and the paper map he had stuffed in the glove compartment was practically useless in the pitch-black darkness. The narrow road twisted and turned through the woods, the dense trees looming over his car like silent watchers. Jake squinted at the dirt-streaked windshield as his headlights struggled to cut through the thick fog that had rolled in. He hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour, and his unease grew with every passing minute. Up ahead, a crooked wooden sign appeared on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by his headlights. It read, "Oak Ridge Cemetery, 1 mile." Jake shivered. He hadn't seen a sign for any towns, gas stations, or even a place to pull over. The idea of a cemetery being the only landmark didn't sit well with him. The road narrowed even further as he continued, and the fog thickened, wrapping around his car like a damp, suffocating blanket. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing with thoughts of horror movies and ghost stories. He laughed nervously to himself, shaking his head. "Get a grip, Jake. It's just a quiet road." But then he saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, partially obscured by the fog. Jake's heart leapt into his throat. As he approached, the figure came into focus, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her hair wild and unkempt. She didn't wave or move to signal for help. She just stood there, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Jake slowed the car, unsure of what to do. His instincts told him to keep driving, but the part of him that didn't want to leave someone stranded on a dark road won out. He rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, her hollow eyes locked on his. Then, without a word, she raised her arm and pointed down the road. Jake's stomach churned. "Do you need me to take you somewhere? Is there a town nearby?" She didn't answer. Her arm remained outstretched, pointing to a sharp bend in the road where the fog seemed unnaturally thick. The longer Jake stared at her, the more wrong she looked. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her movements were unnaturally stiff. He felt a cold chill creep down his spine. The rational part of him screamed to drive away, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled forward. Against his better judgment, he nodded and said, "All right, I'll go that way." As soon as the words left his mouth, the woman lowered her arm and stepped back into the shadows of the trees, vanishing as if she had never been there. Jake's chest tightened, but he pressed on, his tires crunching over the gravel as he rounded the bend. The fog grew denser, swirling around the car like smoke. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and he began to lose his sense of direction. He checked his watch. It was past midnight now, but the eerie silence made time feel irrelevant. Then he saw it. The cemetery appeared out of nowhere, its rusted iron gates standing wide open. Rows of crooked tombstones jutted out from the ground like jagged teeth, their inscriptions worn and unreadable. A massive oak tree stood at the center, its bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Jake's hands trembled on the wheel. He had no reason to stop, but something compelled him to pull over. As soon as he cut the engine, the oppressive silence pressed in, broken only by the faint creak of the gates swaying in an invisible breeze. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the frigid air. The fog was thicker here, curling around the gravestones and clinging to the ground like a living thing. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. No response. Just the sound of the gates creaking and the wind whistling through the trees. He glanced back at his car, tempted to get back in and leave, but his feet carried him forward as if drawn by an unseen force. As he neared the oak tree, he noticed something strange. A fresh grave, the earth still loose and damp, sat directly beneath the tree's sprawling roots. A simple wooden cross marked the spot, but there was no name, no date, just a single word etched into the wood: leave. Jake's heart pounded. He turned to head back to his car, but froze. The woman from the road was standing just beyond the grave, her vacant eyes fixed on him. Her dress fluttered in a wind he couldn't feel, and her lips moved as if she were whispering, but no sound came out. Jake stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the grave. He fell hard, the damp earth clinging to his hands as he scrambled to get up. The woman stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, his voice cracking. She raised her hand again, pointing, not at him, but past him. Jake turned his head slowly and felt his blood run cold. Behind him, the other graves were opening. Skeletal hands clawed their way out of the dirt, followed by decomposed bodies dragging themselves toward him. Their empty eye sockets seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, and their mouths gaped in silent screams. Panic surged through Jake. He bolted toward his car, not daring to look back. He fumbled with the door handle, his fingers numb with fear, and finally managed to throw himself inside. The engine sputtered to life, and he floored the gas, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before finding traction. The fog parted as he sped away, the figures disappearing into the mist. When he finally reached the main road, the fog lifted entirely, and the stars became visible again. He didn't stop until he reached a gas station miles away. The clerk eyed him curiously as he stumbled inside, pale and trembling. "You all right, man?" the clerk asked. Jake nodded shakily. "Yeah, just got lost. Took a wrong turn." The clerk frowned. "Where'd you end up?" Jake hesitated, then said, "Near a cemetery. Oak Ridge, I think." The clerk's face paled. "Oak Ridge? That place burned down 50 years ago. Ain't been no road there since. You must have gotten turned around." Jake didn't argue. He grabbed a bottle of water, paid, and left, vowing never to drive alone at night again. To this day, he refuses to talk about what he saw, or what might have followed him home.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a quick detour, just a simple wrong turn. At least that's what Lisa kept telling herself as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale in the dim glow of her dashboard lights. The GPS had lost its signal half an hour ago, and the smooth highway had given way to a cracked, narrow road surrounded by dense woods. "I told you to check the directions before we left," her younger sister, Megan, muttered from the passenger seat, her voice tinged with irritation. "I did check," Lisa shot back, her voice sharper than intended. "This wasn't part of the plan." Megan leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. "Yeah, no kidding." The road stretched on, winding endlessly with no signs, no streetlights, and no hint of other cars. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves. "I don't think anyone's been on this road for years," Megan said, peering out the window. "We should turn around." Lisa sighed. "There's no room to turn around. I'll keep going until I find a wider spot." As they rounded another bend, the headlights caught a sudden flash of movement, a figure darting across the road. Lisa slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. "Did you see that?" Lisa asked, her heart pounding. "Yeah," Megan whispered, her eyes fixed on the darkened trees ahead. "What was it? A deer?" "I don't think so." Lisa scanned the road and the edges of the forest, but there was no sign of anything. Megan shivered. "Let's just keep moving." Lisa nodded and eased the car forward. The air inside the car grew colder, and Megan fumbled to adjust the vents. "Why is the heat not working?" she asked. Lisa glanced at the temperature gauge. Everything seemed normal, but the chill in the car was undeniable, seeping into their bones. The road dipped, and soon they were driving through a hollow, the trees on either side towering higher than before. Shadows flickered in the periphery of their vision, but whenever Lisa looked directly at them, there was nothing there. "I don't like this," Megan said, her voice trembling. "Me neither," Lisa admitted, her hands tightening on the wheel. Just as she finished speaking, the headlights illuminated an old wooden sign on the side of the road. The words were faded, but they could just make out the name. "Ashcroft Hollow." "Ashcroft? Ashcroft?" Megan repeated. "Isn't that the name of that ghost story Mom used to tell us?" Lisa's stomach sank. She remembered the story well, about a small abandoned town where people had vanished without a trace decades ago. Travelers who strayed too far off the main road supposedly found themselves there, unable to leave. "It's just a coincidence," Lisa said, though she didn't believe it herself. The road narrowed further, and then up ahead they saw it, a cluster of dark, dilapidated buildings. The town seemed to emerge from the shadows, its structures leaning precariously, their windows like empty eye sockets. "Lisa, don't stop," Megan whispered urgently. "I'm not planning to," Lisa said, but her foot hovered over the brake as they passed what looked like an old general store. The air felt heavier here, and the sense of being watched was almost unbearable. Megan gasped suddenly and pointed out her window. "Look," Lisa turned her head briefly, just in time to see a figure standing in the doorway of one of the buildings. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes sunken and lifeless. Lisa pressed the accelerator, her pulse racing. "We're getting out of here." But as the car sped up, the road ahead seemed to twist unnaturally, looping back toward the town. "This can't be right," Lisa said, panic creeping into her voice. "We just left that building," Megan said, pointing at the same general store they had passed moments ago. Lisa gritted her teeth and kept driving. The road curved again, and yet, no matter which way they turned, they kept ending up back at the same cluster of buildings. "This isn't possible," Lisa muttered, her voice cracking. Megan stared ahead, her face pale. "Lisa, look." In the middle of the road stood a woman in a long, dark dress. Her face was hidden under a veil and her hands hung limply at her sides. Lisa slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet away from the figure. The woman didn't move. "Go around her," Megan screamed. Lisa tried, steering the car to the side, but as they passed, the woman's head snapped toward them. Through the veil, her face was visible, gaunt, with deep, hollow sockets where her eyes should have been. Megan screamed, and Lisa floored the gas, the car roaring forward. But just as they thought they had escaped, the headlights revealed the woman standing in the road ahead once more. "No," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. The woman began to walk toward the car, her movements slow and deliberate. "Lisa, what do we do?" Megan asked, tears streaming down her face. Lisa didn't answer. She shifted the car into reverse and backed away, but the woman was there again, standing behind them. "She's everywhere," Megan sobbed. The car sputtered suddenly and the engine cut out. The headlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. "Try it again," Megan urged. Lisa turned the key, but the engine wouldn't start. The sound of footsteps echoed around them, circling the car. Megan grabbed Lisa's arm, her nails digging in. "She's out there." Lisa couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the backseat door handle began to rattle. Megan screamed, and Lisa fumbled to lock the doors, dropped her fingers trembling. The rattling stopped, but the oppressive silence returned, suffocating them. Suddenly, a face appeared at Megan's window. It was the woman, her empty socket staring directly at her. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Go away," Megan screamed, pounding on the door. The woman's grin widened and then she disappeared. Lisa seized the moment and turned the key again. The engine roared to life, and she didn't hesitate. She floored the gas, speeding down the road as fast as the car would go. The town faded into the distance, and after what felt like an eternity, they emerged onto a main road. Neither of them spoke as Lisa drove, their breaths shaky and uneven. It wasn't until they saw the lights of a gas station that they finally pulled over. Lisa parked the car and turned to Megan, her hands still shaking. "Did that really happen?" Megan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa didn't answer. She didn't need to. The long, deep scratches running along the side of the car were proof enough.
Story number 8.
It was a late autumn evening when I found myself driving home after visiting my childhood friend Emily. We'd spent the day catching up at her house on the outskirts of town, where the roads started to thin out into wooded, isolated paths. I hadn't seen her in years, and as we said our goodbyes, I was feeling nostalgic and a little disoriented. I didn't mind, though. Being on unfamiliar roads didn't bother me too much. The drive home was supposed to be quick, just a straight route down Highway 23, but a few miles in, I saw the detour signs. The main highway was blocked off due to road work, and the only way around was a series of back roads I didn't recognize. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I followed the detour, trusting the signs to guide me. As I wound my way through the countryside, the streetlights grew fewer and the road got narrower. Soon, there was nothing but thick trees on either side of me, with only the occasional house scattered far from the road. I felt the chill in the air and the weight of the darkness pressing in on me, but the sound of the tires against the pavement was oddly comforting. Eventually, the road split. One way continued straight, the other veered off into the forest. There was a small wooden sign at the fork. The letters nearly faded from age. I couldn't make out the name, but I figured either route would eventually lead me back to the main road, so I took the right turn. The road immediately became rougher, more gravel than asphalt, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. I checked my phone, but there was no service, just like the last few miles. It felt like I'd been driving on this empty road for longer than I should have when I noticed something strange up ahead. A figure standing by the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. As I neared, I saw it was a woman, hunched over as though in distress. I slowed the car, my first instinct to help her. I rolled down the window and called out, "Are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. She was thin, her clothes ragged, and her hair hung in wet strands over her face. She didn't look like she belonged in these woods. I stopped the car just a few feet from her. "Hey, do you need a ride somewhere?" I asked again, my voice trembling slightly. She lifted her head slowly, and I was immediately struck by how pale she looked. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide and dark like black holes. There was something wrong about her. Then she spoke, but her voice was faint, almost a whisper. "Turn back." I blinked, not quite sure I'd heard her right. "Turn back now," she repeated, her eyes never leaving mine. Something about her tone unsettled me. "What do you mean?" I asked, instinctively looking around. The woods felt oppressive, like they were closing in. She took a few slow steps toward the car, and that's when I saw it. A trail leading into the forest behind her, barely visible in the dim light. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I hadn't seen this path before, and yet it felt like it had been there forever. "Turn back," the woman whispered once more, stepping back and raising a finger toward the trail. I shook my head, suddenly uneasy. "Look, I don't have time for this," I muttered, pulling away slowly, but before I could drive off, I heard something that stopped me cold. A low, unsettling whisper, like a wind gust through trees, but much more deliberate. The woman hadn't moved, but the sound was coming from her, as though the air around her was alive. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and without thinking, I took the road she'd pointed to, as though I were being pulled against my will. I could see her in the rearview mirror, standing in the same spot, her hand still pointed at the trail. The path grew more isolated, and soon the road became an overgrown dirt track, the car bouncing and jostling over rocks and uneven ground. My breath quickened as I looked around. The trees were denser now, and it felt as though the world had fallen silent. I couldn't hear anything except the thrum of my engine and the occasional crack of a branch under the car's tires. A few minutes later, I saw it. Through the trees, I could make out a faint shape, an old house. It was half hidden by the brush, but it was unmistakable with its sagging porch and broken windows. It was abandoned, but it felt wrong. Something about the house called to me, drawing me closer. I pulled up to the front, the tires grinding to a halt in front of the cracked porch. The house was larger than I thought, its frame buckling under years of neglect. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes, and the door hung loosely, half open, as if inviting me in. I sat frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman's warning echoed in my mind, "Turn back." But I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me urged me to go further, to step inside and see what was hidden behind the broken walls. I reached for the door handle, but just before I could touch it, I heard a sound, a soft creaking, like something moving upstairs. I froze, the blood draining from my face. I turned around slowly and saw a figure standing in the doorway of the house. At first, I thought it was the woman from the road, but this was different. This figure was darker, more solid, its outline sharper, as if it was made from the shadows themselves. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest, but the figure stepped closer, moving toward me at an unnatural pace. My breath caught in my throat and panic surged through me. I stumbled back toward my car, shaking with fear. As I backed away, I glanced over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. I could see nothing but the shadows stretching long behind me, but I didn't dare turn around to look. My hands fumbled to open the car door. Finally, I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed the car into reverse. I floored the accelerator, the gravel screeching beneath the tires as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road again, the familiar, comforting stretch of asphalt finally breaking the suffocating silence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the house, how it had followed me, how its presence had been so suffocating. The road signs were clearer now. The detour ended just ahead. I had gone in the wrong direction, so far off course that I didn't know where I had ended up. The next morning, I tried to look up the road I had taken, but when I searched the map, the street didn't even exist. I couldn't find any mention of that house, that trail, or the woman in the woods. It was as though I had never driven down that road at all. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I'll never forget the warning she gave me. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The night was clear, the stars barely visible through the haze of city lights as Sarah navigated the highway. She had been on the road for hours, heading home after a work conference in the next city over. It was late, well past midnight, and the exhaustion was beginning to settle in her bones. Her GPS indicated she was only a few miles away from her exit, but the long stretch of road ahead seemed endless. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced at the screen, a message from her best friend, Emily. "Did you make it to your hotel yet?" Sarah quickly replied, keeping one hand on the wheel. "Almost there. 30 minutes tops." But then a sign appeared on the side of the road, barely visible in the dark. She squinted, slowing down. The sign was old, weathered, and for a split second, Sarah thought she saw the words "Scenic Route" under the faded name of a nearby town. The GPS didn't indicate any detour, but the sign beckoned her, promising a more direct route home. Against her better judgment, Sarah took the turn, thinking it was just a small detour that would help her avoid the growing traffic. The road immediately became narrow and winding, the streetlights sporadic, their yellow glow casting eerie shadows on the trees. She checked the time, already 1:30 a.m., and felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. The further she drove, the more isolated it seemed. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The road curved tightly, winding deeper into an unfamiliar forest. The trees were tall, their branches twisting above her in a dark canopy. The air grew cooler, and the sound of her tires crunching on gravel became the only noise. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the lights of the car flickered. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She swerved slightly, trying to maintain control, but it was like something had drained the life from the car. The dashboard lights dimmed as the engine died, leaving her in total darkness. "Not now," Sarah muttered under her breath, fumbling with the key to start the car again. But no matter how many times she twisted the key, the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic began to creep in, but she forced herself to breathe. She checked her phone. No signal. Of course. She remembered the GPS said something about limited reception in this area, but she hadn't expected it to be this bad. Just then, a faint light appeared ahead, something soft, almost like a glow. Sarah squinted, wondering if it was the reflection of the moon on a nearby clearing. As she drove forward, the light grew brighter, until it revealed the silhouette of a house at the edge of the road, tucked among the trees. It was old, abandoned-looking, with a sagging porch and chipped paint. The windows were dark, but there was a faint light flickering inside, as though someone had left a light on upstairs. Against her better judgment, she decided to stop. She needed help, and surely someone would be awake in such a secluded area. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, but the idea of being stuck in the middle of nowhere terrified her more. She pulled the car into the driveway, its wheels crunching over the gravel. She sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It didn't look like it had been lived in for years. In fact, everything about it felt off, like it was a relic from another time. Still, she grabbed her purse, checked the locks on the doors, and stepped out of the car. The front porch creaked under her weight as she approached the door. It was a strange, cold night. No crickets, no wind, just silence, thick and suffocating. She knocked, but there was no answer. After a few moments, she knocked again, louder this time. The door swung open suddenly, as though it had been waiting for her. Standing in the doorway was a man. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, and his clothes tattered, as if he had been there for much too long. He didn't smile, didn't move. He just stared at her with vacant eyes. "Hello?" Sarah asked hesitantly. "My car broke down a few miles back. I need to use your phone, or maybe get some help." The man didn't speak. He only stepped aside, holding the door open slightly. The air coming from inside the house was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and something else, something rotten. Despite every warning in her head, Sarah stepped inside. The house was dark. The only light came from a flickering candle on a table in the corner. The walls were lined with old photographs, strange, faded images of families she didn't recognize. Some were black and white, others yellowed with age. They all seemed to stare back at her, their eyes empty. I just need help," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm stranded." The man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked into the living room. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then followed him. The house was too quiet, too still. It was like no one had lived there in years. Yet there were signs of life. Crumbs on the table, a dusty coat hanging by the door, and the faintest trace of a person's presence. The man sat in an old rocking chair near the fireplace, staring blankly into the dim light. "Don't go," he murmured. "Don't go where?" Sarah asked, confused. She had been preparing to leave as soon as she could figure out what to do. "Downstairs," he replied, his voice barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She glanced around the room, trying to understand what he meant. But then her gaze was drawn to the hallway behind him, where a door stood ajar, leading to a darkened staircase. "Stay," the man said again, his voice now rising. "You can't leave. Not yet." Fear flooded Sarah's chest. "I need to go," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm not staying here." She turned quickly, but the door she had entered through was now gone, replaced by a wall. Panic set in as she backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out. There had to be another way. Suddenly, a noise came from below, a slow, creaking sound that seemed to echo from the basement. Her heart pounded. The man stood abruptly, his pale face twisted into something grotesque. "I warned you," he hissed. Without thinking, Sarah bolted for the hallway, searching for an exit, but her feet seemed to sink deeper into the floor with every step. The house itself seemed to warp around her, stretching and contracting in ways that didn't make sense. She reached the stairs and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. Down the stairs, at the bottom of the staircase, the dim light revealed something else. A figure standing in the darkness. It was a woman. Her body was hunched, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at Sarah as though she had been waiting for her. "I'm sorry," the woman whispered. "You shouldn't have come." The last thing Sarah heard before everything went black was the man's voice, far behind her. "Now you're ours."
Story number 10.
I had just moved to a small town for work, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. It was the kind of quiet town where nothing much happened, and I was glad for the peacefulness after years of city living. One chilly autumn evening, I decided to drive to a local diner for some comfort food after a long day of settling in. I didn't know the area well yet, but I figured it couldn't be that hard to find a small-town diner. I left my apartment and headed down the main road. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape. After a few minutes, I saw a sign that indicated a left turn to the diner, and I followed the instructions from my GPS. The road immediately began to twist and narrow, the trees on either side growing dense and close together. It felt like I was driving into a forest, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The road had started out paved, but as I continued, it became less so. The smooth asphalt turned into cracked and uneven concrete, then into gravel. I looked up from the road, noting the increasing darkness as the trees blocked out much of the remaining daylight. There weren't any other cars, which I found odd for a road that supposedly led to a popular diner. But I didn't think about it too much. I figured it was just a quiet evening. I turned a sharp corner, and the headlights illuminated what looked like an old abandoned house standing by the road. It was a dilapidated thing, with broken windows and a crumbling roof. I could barely make out the faded letters on a sign nearby that seemed to read St. Anne's Road. It was strange. I hadn't seen this place on my GPS, and I'd expected the diner to be just a few miles further. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. Movement. A figure standing by the edge of the house facing me. It was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her hair hanging loose down her back. Her face was obscured by shadow, but I could see her pale hands resting at her sides. There was something unnerving about the way she stood there, as if waiting for me. I slowed the car down, staring at her. The figure didn't move, but somehow it felt like she was beckoning me. I should have driven away immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. I made the decision to stop and ask if she needed help, but before I could, she disappeared into the shadows of the house. I didn't know if she'd moved so quickly or if she had vanished entirely, but I was left with an unsettling sense that something wasn't right. After a long moment, I made a sharp left turn at the next intersection, following the winding road further, hoping to get to the diner. The night was settling in, and the trees were casting long shadows over the road. The air felt cooler now, and the silence of the road made everything seem even more isolated. I tried to shake the image of the woman from my mind, but it lingered. It felt too real, too vivid to be a figment of my imagination. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, mournful wail, as if coming from the woods just beyond the edge of the road. It sent a cold shiver down my spine. My heart raced, and I instinctively glanced around, half expecting to see the woman from the house standing by the trees, but there was nothing. Only the growing darkness. I quickened my pace, desperately hoping to reach a more populated area. I couldn't explain the eerie feeling I had, but everything about the road felt wrong. It was as though the air itself was pressing down on me, and the trees on either side seemed to close in further, swallowing the road. And then I saw it. A large, wooden sign that read, Dead Man's Hollow. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I was certain this wasn't where the diner was supposed to be, but the sign was clear, Dead Man's Hollow. I checked my GPS. It was still showing that I was on the right road, but it didn't make sense. My mind raced. I couldn't figure out how I'd ended up on this road, with the sinister name and the eerie feeling that seemed to creep into my bones. The wailing sound grew louder, and this time, it wasn't just a distant echo. It was coming from the trees, too close, too real. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. I had to get out of here. With my foot on the gas, I sped forward, desperately trying to find my way back. The road twisted and turned, and I kept expecting to see someone appear in the rearview mirror, but I forced myself to look ahead. The trees were now so close I could barely see beyond the windshield. Then, through the fog that had rolled in from nowhere, I saw headlights in the distance. My heart leaped at the sight of another vehicle. I blinked, hoping it wasn't just some trick of the mist. The headlights grew brighter, and I found myself slowing down to make sure it wasn't another ghostly figure. As the car approached, I saw the figure of a man standing beside it. He was dressed in dark clothes, and as he got closer, he raised his hand, motioning for me to stop. My hands were slick with sweat as I reluctantly brought the car to a halt. The man leaned in, his face shadowed but his voice clear. "You shouldn't be here. Turn around." His tone was serious, and his eyes, dark, empty, gave me the sense that he wasn't talking about the road, but something much more dangerous. "Why? What's wrong with this road?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he just nodded toward the way I had come. "Go back. Leave. Before it's too late." The wail grew louder, more urgent, echoing through the air around us. I looked behind me, terrified that I might see something chasing me. But when I turned back to the man, he was gone. The car he had been standing next to had disappeared, leaving nothing but the empty road and the fog. I didn't think twice. I slammed the car into reverse, spun the wheel, and tore down the road, the wailing still echoing in my ears. My eyes never left the road as I sped away, not daring to look back again. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. The fog lifted, and the world felt almost normal again. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing heart. But as I drove back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching from just beyond my vision. The next day, I tried to ask around about Dead Man's Hollow, but no one seemed to know it. It was as if the place didn't exist. And the woman in the woods, no one had seen her either. It was like she had vanished, leaving me with nothing but the terrifying memory of the wrong turn I had taken and the ghostly warning that had saved my life. Story the end.